Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. You know, there's a new game in town. It's called the Hunger Gains. Housing gains plus hunger pains equals the Hunger Gains. While a user on my website named Andy Perry coined the phrase, it was David Cameron who invented the brutal game in which there are no housing gains without hunger pains. Stacy.
Yes, Max, it's a brutal game. Welcome to this world where there are no wealth creation jobs or wealth creating industry. We have just the financialized world of a zero-sum game. So therefore, you can only have wealth redistribution, and it looks like it's been turned into a game of gains versus hunger pains. David Cameron rejects Help to Buy housing bubble fear. Prime Minister David Cameron has dismissed fears the Help to Buy scheme is creating a property market bubble as he hailed it as a success. Number 10 says almost 750 homes have been bought and 6,000 offers made since the mortgage guarantee scheme started. Now, this was in the beginning of January, and now, this week, we hear that the average house price has now passed £250,000 in the United Kingdom. That's over 400,000 US dollars.
Yeah, it's an interesting paradox. If you were to tell the average British person, hey, guess what? The price of gas just doubled, or petrol as they call it here. Price of petrol just doubled. Isn't that great? Of course, the average person would say, no, that's terrible. If you tell them, hey, the average house price just doubled, isn't that great? Well, no, not really, because it causes an enormous economic strain that results in, as we're pointing out here, hunger pains. The number of people going hungry in the UK to afford for David Cameron's re-election Buy to Help scheme and housing bubble is human tragedy of which he cares not.
Well, Shelter, which is the homeless charity here, has warned that prices are spiraling out of control, and they're seeing a huge rise in homelessness because of not only the house price gains, but also the inflation.
Yes, the way that inflation is calculated does not include the daily necessities in the proportion that people consume them. If you were to do an accurate reading, you would end up with an 8 to 9% inflation with wages barely moving, which is leading to poverty.
So now, Vince Cable had said there's a raging housing boom in London, and of course, house prices here in London are up over 12% in the past 12 months. But in general, over the UK, it's now £250,000. Average UK house price hits £250,000, ONS says. So this is the Office of National Statistics, and they said that in 2013, house prices rose by 5.5%, though the nationwide says that it actually rose 8.4% across the UK, including London, which is over 12%.
Well, you know, it's like a super tanker filled with quantitative easing cash that's moving through this narrow channel called the British economy on the benefit of those who are living inside that super tanker, but everyone living on the banks is getting flooded out. And that flooding, by the way, in the UK recently is a direct result of money not being spent on infrastructure and going right into the pockets of financiers and housing speculators. So people are starving. They're being flooded out of their homes. For David Cameron's re-election Help to Buy Ponzi housing bubble, which is enabled by Mark Carney, who just left Canada after building an enormous housing bubble there that has just popped, that's now collapsing in the wake of his financial tragedy.
Of course, you look at that price, £250,000 across the UK, right, for the average house price. The average income here is something like £26,000. So you do the math, or the maths if you're British. Now let's turn to the hunger pain part of these games. David Cameron defends moral benefit cuts, says they bring hope. David Cameron has denied that benefit cuts are plunging people into poverty, saying they actually give people hope. The Prime Minister hit back at criticism from the head of the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales, insisting that they were part of his moral mission for the country.
Well, David Cameron is a troll. And what I mean by that is there was some study done recently to examine the psychological profile of a troll, and they found that they are sadistic and cruel.
Yeah.
And David Cameron is sadistic and cruel in his interpretation of economics, which suggests that by cutting people's benefits to make more money available for housing price speculation is somehow sound economic policy. That's beyond just making bad decisions. That's sadistic and cruel.
Yeah, and now remember the first part where we're talking about the housing gains, he kept on rejecting. He rejected the notion that his plans, his policies of the Help to Buy were causing it. Here he's denying his policies are causing the hunger. And yet, public health emergency declared as 1 in 6 GPs was asked to refer a patient to food banks in the last year. 1 in 6 family doctors has been asked to refer a patient to a food bank in the past year, a new survey has found, with GPs reporting that benefits delays are leaving people without money for food for weeks on end. So 5,500 people were treated for malnutrition in hospitals in the UK last year, and over 500,000 people visited food banks. Now, the Church of England as well also came out. Several bishops, hundreds of bishops actually, dozens of them, came out and they said that it was the delay. You speak of sadism. It was the delay. They keep on being given these delays in their benefits, receiving their benefits. There's all sorts of arbitrary delays. So people are suddenly losing access to food.
Yes, Mark Carney, the Bank of England chair, speaks of the UK economy achieving escape velocity. The idea being that if we keep the housing bubble pumped, at some point it will trickle down to the masses. This is the same theory that was used in America when the U.S. Army rolled across the plains and displaced the indigenous population, thinking that someday when the American economy grows, the American Indian, as they're called, would somehow find a benefit. That 200 years later has not happened. Here, Cameron is rolling across Britain, displacing millions of British people, leaving them, consigning them to a life of poverty and flooding with no insurance, house prices in an enormous bubble, because he thinks he's going to achieve escape velocity, according to his theory, which so far throughout history has never, ever happened. You've never been able to cure a debt problem by increasing more debt. What Cameron fails to mention, and this is part of his cruel, sadistic propaganda, is that the debt in Britain has never been higher. He's only increasing the debt. You know, I mean, it's the same theory that they have in North Korea now. I mean, if you just genuflect to the leader in egregiously inappropriate manner, you will save yourself from the gulag, maybe, but in the UK, unless you kowtow to David Cameron, you're going to be flooded and starved to death.
Well, it's also a game, as we've pointed out, as you pointed out in your opening monologue, is that it's the Hunger Games. It's a game, it's a command and control game. The guy controlling it is Mark Carney and George Osborne and the likes of those people. Now, we're also going to look at the fact that you can't even work your way out of this hunger situation. You can't, there's no way to get out of the game without picking up the tools that they provide for the game players in this game. So here's a tweet from Robert Peston, who is the BBC economics editor. UK productivity, especially output per hour, fell further behind most rich country competitors in 2012. So these are the new data coming out. And again, productivity down here. That means wealth creation is down here. That means if you're not playing this game, the Hunger Games, then you're getting hungrier and more homeless.
Right. They don't want to pay people. Okay. What he's talking about there is that the hours worked for an hour's pay is getting less money.
Well, you're creating less wealth with every hour you're working because there's nothing to do but to sell a burger at McDonald's. And there's this misallocation of capital, as we talked about previously. The fact that
they don't want to pay anybody. In other words,
exactly.
they only want to pay these bonuses to bankers for speculating on the housing bubble and creating financial mayhem. They don't want to pay people to work an hour. Wages and labor are just not needed. As we've explained before, the tax revenue needed to service the debt is not needed from collecting taxes from the average British citizen, because they just go to the Bank of England and they print the money to pay their schemes. They don't need labor. They're expendable. They don't need the citizens to work. They don't need their taxes. They don't need them. So they treat them like garbage. And Cameron just in the face of the British citizen because he doesn't need them. He just needs them to come around every once in a while and vote. And of course, to get the vote, they don't care if they stage some kind of horrific catastrophe in some foreign land, create a catastrophe, and get a vote for a month or two, and then go right back on the massive golden shower that is David Cameron's policies. He doesn't need the British citizen, so he treats them like dirt.
So the zero-sum game of the Hunger Gains relies on, because it's not relying on wealth creation here in the UK or productivity gains here in the UK, just a reshuffling of wealth around the, the city center. It relies on China to actually make stuff and create stuff, whether it's horse meat burgers or whatever. So China tapering U.S. debt faster than Fed. And this is regarding a Bloomberg article noting that China pared its position in U.S. government bonds by $47.8 billion, or 3.6%, to $1.27 trillion, the largest decline since December 2011, according to U.S. Treasury data. At the same time, international investors increased holdings by 1.4%, or by $78 billion in December, pushing foreign holdings to a record $5.79 trillion. So overseas investors hold 48.8% of the $11.9 trillion in tradable U.S. securities. China is the largest of those, and they're paring back radically.
Yeah, and who's picking up the slack? Is the American government itself, is buying back its own debt. It's like a dog returning to eat its own vomit. I mean, that's the American financial policy. Same thing with Mark Carney. He should put on a doggy suit, or maybe Doge, and go down there to the well of quantitative easing and just eat his own financial vomit, because that's the only policy they have here in the UK, and it'll only get worse because foreign creditors don't want this junk debt that they're pushing, because it won't possibly pay off. There's no way that Britain will pay off its sovereign debt. There's no scenario where that's going to happen. They will have to default, or they'll have to just keep printing until hyperinflation kicks in. In the meantime, a few people will get rich by speculating in the housing bubble, and this is a dead certainty, essentially. Stacey, we must go.
Okay.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more.
Welcome to the future.
On this month's show, we go on tour in Tatarstan, where we meet some of Kazan's young innovators in the IT capital. We find out how to bake black wings for composite aircraft and go off-road in a modern-day Viking, but still manage to take some snaps for the album.
Technology update here on RT. We've got the future covered.
In Russia, at least, being gay is not criminalized. There are absolutely no punishment for being gay in Russia. The only thing that this law precludes is spreading information, favorable information on non-traditional sexual behavior.
What, are you going to legislate against couples who swing, who trade partners, or is it only a certain type of sex that you're legally able to have? So what is propaganda? It's so unclear.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Alistair McLeod of goldmoney.com. Alistair, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
It's my pleasure, Max.
All right, you wrote something fascinating here. Quote, the redemption of emerging market currencies into the U.S. dollar mirrors pre-World War I bank runs, except on a global scale. Talk about it.
Right. To understand the point, you have to bear in mind that before the First World War, we were on a gold standard. The world was on a gold standard. And you could exchange your dollars for gold. you could exchange your pound notes for sovereigns. So the amount of paper that was built up in the global economy was essentially exchangeable into gold. Now that failed because the weight of paper grew too large. We now have a situation where, cut the gold, we've now got the dollar. That is the reserve currency. So in effect, all the currency in all the world is pyramided, if there is such a word, on top of the dollar. So we have a situation which is essentially unstable in the event that there is a run out of other currencies back into the dollar, or out of the dollar into other currencies, which would be a second order, as it were.
So the dollar is world reserve currency, and it is the base of a pyramid, so to speak, where all other currencies are basically collateralized by the U.S. dollar. So you're making the comparison pre-World War I, where all the global currencies were backed essentially by gold. You had a gold standard. The gold was the medium of exchange on a global basis, and that broke down, and it led to World War I. Is that a fairly common accepted wisdom by historians that World War I, because a lot of people talk about World War I and they say it was, the Archduke of Ferdinand got assassinated and it was an accident.
It's in the news now. It's the 100th anniversary.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, but can we look back and say this gold relationship and the breakdown, as you describe it, was really more, I think, part and parcel of why these events?
Yeah, I think World War I actually started for different reasons. You have the character of the Kaiser and his cousins, the Tsar and also our king.
Different spelling, by the way, than Max Kaiser.
Different spelling, indeed. The thing really sort of got out of control, and it looked like World War I. I mean, it's still controversial today how it started. So that was an accident, and I don't think it directly had anything to do with gold. The difference between the gold standard and the dollar as a reserve currency is that the gold standard worked on a fixed price. You could exchange your pounds for a fixed amount of gold, your dollars for a fixed amount of gold. There is no fixed price at all between the minor currencies and the dollar.
Okay, so...
But nonetheless, we do have this pyramid, and the pyramid is absolutely massive. I mean, for example, if you take the combined money supply of the next 50 currencies other than the dollar, we're looking at a total, call it M3 if you like, global M3, of around about $67 trillion equivalent. On top of that, you've got shadow banking. The Financial Stability Board, which at the time was headed by Mark Carney and a committee set up by the Bank of International Settlements, calculated in 2011 that shadow banking worldwide was $67 trillion. Sorry, I'm talking trillion dollars. I think I said billion earlier. So you add that into it. Now today, given the acceleration of shadow banking in China, we're probably looking at about 75 trillion. Now if you add up all these bits and pieces, you've got US M3, you've got global M3, and then you've got shadow banking. The gearing is roughly 40 times the monetary base in the United States. But if you take it even further and you say, what was it relative to the monetary base before the Lehman crisis, you end up with about 130 to 140 times. This is some gearing, and it's potentially very unstable.
Okay, you mentioned a few things there. So we'll touch on World War I again briefly and then move on. But the point being that pre-World War I, you had currencies that were trading off gold, and the price of gold was known and the value was accepted. The difference being here, you've got dollar as a world reserve currency. Everything's priced in the dollar, but that value of the dollar is highly subjective. There is no clear
It's subjective. There is no fixed exchange rate between these currencies and the dollar.
Starting in 1971, the world went on this global fiat currency experiment when the U.S. closed the gold window. So everything is massively in flux. But we do know that the amount of gearing or leverage has increased almost exponentially. And you're saying now that it's higher than the pre-Lehman situation. Post-Lehman, let's talk about that for a second, because after Lehman collapsed, the idea was we'd have some reform, we'd have some attempt to rein in the speculating.
That may have been the intention.
Right.
We had no reform. We had no reining in of speculation. Sorry.
It's just gone. The quants, the quantitative analysts on Wall Street said that the problem was not massive debt. The problem was we got our calculations wrong. We're gonna redo our calculations, and we're gonna double, triple, quadruple debt. It's just a repeat of the same madness, correct?
Absolutely. The solution to the Lehman crisis was to issue as much currency as it took to rescue the banks and stabilize the financial system. That is the inheritance we have today, and that is why we have got a money bubble of the proportions I've just described. It has its roots, in effect, in the Lehman crisis.
And you see, but at this moment, though, you do see evidence of a bit of a bank run.
Well, the potential is there. When we had the second tapering announcement, you saw that there was a big wobble in the Indian rupee, the Turkish lira, the Argentinian, and so on and so forth. All these sort of minor currencies suddenly sort of caught a cold. It then sort of settled down. Now, the reason that these minor currencies catch a cold is because they are entirely dependent on the balance of reserves they have in dollars to defend the currency, and the amount of money, cross-border investment, that has gone into those economies to puff them up really from the days of the Lehman crisis, or more specifically, could probably go back to the year 2000. So if that money, if that international footloose money decides that the returns are not there, and suddenly it is a question of risk rather than profit, then that is going to start flowing in the opposite direction. We then have the scenario which will look very, very like the post-Credit Anstalt crisis in 1934. I think it was 33, 34. So you can see that these flows are very, very important. And the reason that I highlight this is that this is a time when the Fed has decided to try and slow down the creation of money by introducing tapering on a month-per-month basis. And at the same time, China, the authorities in China have become very, very spooked about what's happening to money and credit in their own economy, and they're trying to rein that in. And you can see that the initial effect of that has been sort of a developing crisis, potentially, in the shadow banking system, where all these coal mines and all the rest of it, who financed themselves through off-balance sheet lending, where people bought shares in a trust which was set up specifically to collateralize a loan for this coal company, that coal company. These are coming unstuck. And China now has the problem. Does she rescue these things and say, look, we're not printing any more money. We're not allowing the expansion of bank credit anymore. If you made the wrong investment, it's down to you, mate. Do they say that, or do they rescue it? And that's where we are now. And so we've got the two largest economies in the world who have got this problem. And they are threatening to put the whole of the international investment flow situation into reverse. And that is a big, big danger. Now, I don't think it's necessarily going to carry through, because at some stage, I would assume that the Chinese and the Americans, the Fed, would back off and say, our priorities have changed, and the threat now is to the economy from the global economy. They will come up with something else. But the way it looks at the moment, it is actually a very dangerous situation with all that monetary gearing. And that is the point I was trying to make.
Now, 2008, the Lehman crisis, the Fed printed unprecedented amounts of money, quantitative easing, et cetera. And then we find out later that most of it went to foreign banks. They went to Deutsche Bank, it went to BNP, it went to Societe Generale, and some Americans were outraged that, this money didn't go to U.S. People, it went to foreign banks. So the way I envision this, if you will, is there's this enormous yo-yo, and the Fed kind of does a yo-yo trick, where they spin that yo-yo out, and then it pops back into your hand. It seems like they put that money out there, they covered their counterparty risks for their own banks, and now that that's covered to some degree, they're snapping that money back, this tapering, and they're leaving these banks to fend for themselves. They're kind of leaving them in the cold. In the case now of Latin American banks, Central American banks, Venezuela, Argentina, these countries are now in flames.
Yes.
So how much responsibility does the Fed take, or should take, or might take, or in your opinion should take, for getting these countries burning as they are with riots by this yo-yo approach of money?
Yeah. Well, if I had anything to do with it, we wouldn't have got into this situation in the first place. The problem I think the Fed faces is that, having embarked on the post-Lehman strategy of we will rescue the system, whatever happens, we will rescue it. We will produce enough money to do it. They're now seeing the downside of that, because if they're going to restrict the production of money, as you quite rightly point out, a lot of that is keeping the Eurozone afloat, for example.
Okay, let me just jump in for a second, because, of course, the U.S. is not happy with geopolitical trends in Latin America, Venezuela under Chavez, et cetera. They, by pulling in this money, turning off the spigot, they have a benefit in that these countries are now up for political grab. And the U.S., I'm sure, would not mind if they had to step in, as they've done before, and take control. I mean, this is what the history of this region has been. But let's just look on more on a global basis here, because as you point out, the key counterparty in all this is really China, and because China's really vying with the U.S. for economic global supremacy at this point. And as you describe it, the money's being pulled back. China's shadow banking system has been revealed. They're scrambling to cover what looks like a huge gap in their books.
Yeah,
by
bad
any
debts by any description. Yeah.
So, but we also know that at the same time, China has been very aggressively accumulating gold. So the question is, did they see this coming? That's why they've been buying gold. And now that it's here, their worst nightmare, perhaps, do they have enough gold to cover their butts? So, to put it in inelegant terms.
I would put it perhaps even more basically than that, and that is that China has effectively cornered the gold market. The amazing thing is that our statisticians in the West don't want to accept this.
Well, talk about this. What do you mean they've cornered the gold market? Talk about this.
Well, if you look at the amount of gold delivered into the public by the Shanghai Gold Exchange, that last year was around about 2,200 tons. Not the 1,063 tons which the WGC managed to identify.
Their official reserve number.
No, I'm talking about into the public's hands. Yeah, into the public's hands. On top of that, gold was also retained by Hong Kong, and there are cross flows between the mainland and Hong Kong. And if you include Hong Kong, you're looking at a figure, including about 50 tons of coins, of around about 2,800 tons. Now that is almost the same as world mine production. But there is a sting in the tail, because China is the largest producer of gold. And according to the China Gold Association, she produced 430 tons approximately in 2013. So you have to take that 430 tons out of the 2,800 ton figure, and you're left with around about 2,300 tons. So on the basis of Chinese public demand, the world is in a supply deficit and depending on scrap. So we've got this extraordinary situation, and none of the Western analysts in the sort of the mainstream banks and so on and so forth seem prepared to accept this. But it's there. I mean, these are the hardest statistics we have.
Okay, we've got about 10 seconds. So just my question, though, do they have the gold needed to go into this financial currency war at this time? Are they well positioned for this currency war? Yes or no? We got about 5 seconds.
My suspicion is they knew what the situation was in the West, and they thought this was a very good strategic ploy.
Fair enough. Okay, Alistair, we got to go. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
That's my pleasure.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank my guest, Alistair McLeod of goldmoney.com. If you'd like to contact us, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.